Welcome back, everyone. Um, for those who've just started, my name just came in. My name is Rob Raven, and I will be chairing this seminar from the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. And I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from where I'm speaking, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respect to the elders, past and present. And I'm very pleased to see again so many people of you here. We just had a previous seminar with Benjamin Sevigol, giving an excellent talk about negative emission technologies and geoengineering. And this is part of a seminar series that we're organizing from the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. If you're interested in our previous talk, have a look at our website. You can all find them there, and many of them have been recorded, so you can still watch some of those back. This second session of today, I'm really pleased to have Professor Antje Wiener here from the Hamburg University in Germany. And Antje will be sharing the recent findings of the Hamburg Climate Future Outlook. Now, Antje just told me she's actually not a climate scientist, but political scientist, which is really interesting because that brings a completely different kind of view on things like the plausibility of achieving 1.5 degrees climate change. And that's exactly what you will be talking to us about. A large study involving 63 different academics across the social sciences and the physical sciences. So that's, I think, going to be a really, really interesting talk. Before I hand over to you, Antje, just a few practicalities. The total session is about an hour, so we go on until 5 p.m. today. Antje will be speaking for about 35 minutes, and after that we'll have time for Q&A. We also have about 40 or more, 50 people by now online, so that's great. Domi will help us moderate questions that might come in from the online audience. And yeah, Antje, I'm happy to hand over to you for your talk.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it works. Okay, well, hello everybody. I'm sorry for not having been able to listen to your talk, Benjamin. I was really looking forward to that. But the last words, the 80% is social and societal factors. That certainly plays into what I'm going to say. And as Rob rightly said, I'm a political scientist, especially international relations. And when we started drafting this it's a huge grant application. We are working on this with about 200 academics from different disciplines. It's a 5-year project, and we are working currently on the follow-up application for it. And when we started out, you start about drafting these things like 3-4 years before you get the money. And my entire point was, as somebody who does global governance and international relations, how do we actually, once we've got all the life science data, how do we actually take care of implementing them? There is society, there is such a thing. And how do we actually communicate? How do we actually interact? What kind of societal agents are we actually talking about? How do we get companies to talk to each other? And so there's a huge societal component. And this resonated quite well with these colleagues. And as I said to Rob, during the first couple of years, everybody of the climate researchers in the project kept saying, oh, you don't know anything about climate. This has changed slightly, and you'll see perhaps why. And we are currently, we have this report, which has been the Hamburg Climate Futures Outlook. The first outlook was published in 21, and this is the second one, just published on the 1st of February. And a few of us who have been working as program chairs or the speakers of the project are currently kind of touring with trying to kind of present the results and interact with the community around the world with these results, because they are pretty depressing. So that's the spoiler that I'll let you know ahead of time. And now, without further ado, excuse me, I need to look at the slides because that's kind of my notes too. Normally I have kind of a laptop in front of me, but this is not the case here. So we try to systematically analyze not just what we call social drivers, which are social overarching social processes, but also this time we were also looking at physical processes. I'm, of course, a social scientist. I don't know, I can't explain the physical processes to you, but what I'll try to do is I sort of show how the physical processes work in relation to the to the social drivers. So obviously, the key here is about plausibility of the 1.5 degree limit to global warming, the Paris Agreement goals, and we try to do an integrated assessment of the Paris goals. And we all know, you probably know from the previous talk, we will have to reach decarbonization by 2050, and we call it deep decarbonization to be compliant with the 1.5 degree goal, which is already, we're already more talking about something, if we can keep something below 2 degrees, then we are doing really well. The leading question is, what affects the plausibility of attaining the Paris Agreement temperature goals? And I'll say a little bit about plausibility and feasibility in a moment, because we mostly, when we work with data, then we will address feasibility in modeling, for example. And we are looking at 10 social drivers here, and I go into them in detail, and 6 physical processes. This is done by 62 authors from an interdisciplinary group. And all of you who have worked in interdisciplinary groups, especially between kind of the life sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities, I think we spent about 2 or 3 years trying to come to terms, literally speaking. For example, what do we mean by governance? What's policy? What do we mean by regulatory norms? For example, for those of us who study norms, I mean, that can be all sorts of things. What is a norm in the first place? Then people will say, what is an institution? Is a norm a rule? So there's lots of things. And also our life scientists were shocked when we first started speaking about drivers, social drivers. If you talk about a driver in the life sciences, the model will react in a completely different reaction, massively. You have a different amplitude of the model. Whereas when we talk about social drivers, we are talking about overarching social processes. And those are driven by societal agents of different types. And I'll talk about those here. So feasibility or plausibility, you'll see in the IPCC report, the quote, feasibility refers to the potential for a mitigation or adaptation option to be implemented. So then you really look at a kind of a set of data that you've got, and you can tell whether it's feasible or not. If you read our report, you also see that the physical processes, the life scientists always speak about medium or high confidence with which a claim can be made. We wouldn't, in the social sciences, we never talk about that. So that's the difference. And so we agreed on plausibility, where we try to look at a comprehensive assessment of, and this is where historical institutionalists among you will have an aha moment. We talk about enabling and constraining conditions, which is, and we come to the opportunity structure of a situation. Will it push for more resources that we can use in a better way that then affect the plausibility of a given climate future? And so we're not only looking at barriers or the absence of them, but at a wide range of factors that are influencing possible new pathways. And we are towards or away from specific scenarios that we define beforehand. And so we are interested in whether or not these pathways, whether drivers are developing dynamics towards or away from such pathways. And well, I go into this. These are 5 points in the talk. So this bringing together the physical processes and social drivers is relatively new. And especially in Hamburg, the strong social component, social science component, that is also relatively new. We also see that when we always see that when we talk with the press and the media, and they're so used to receiving certain numbers from the life sciences. What's the possibility there? What about that? And we're basically saying, look, perhaps we need to move a little bit more. Perhaps we need to talk more about degrowth or about different options. And so it is more about an interaction, and the presentation of data or findings is often a communicative process in itself. That's why it's also, for us, very important to engage with colleagues at different places around the world. So we're trying to use plausibility to serve multiple disciplines, and we have developed this plausibility assessment framework in order to produce a recurrent global assessment of this plausibility. And this is happening each year. Okay, let's move on. So our argument here is that even with given emission scenarios, there are limits to determining the probability of some physical elements of climate futures due to deep uncertainties in some relevant aspects of physical processes, such as the stability of the Antarctic ice sheet, for example. And so lacking the feasibility of what a robust probabilistic assessment would be, we have tried to come up with something you could call an intermediate framework or step-by-step, which is an alternative framework to assess the plausibility of these climate futures. Society matters is the big thing with which we which was the outcome of the first and also the second report. Staying below 1.5 is not plausible. 2 degrees can become plausible if ambition, implementation, and knowledge gaps are closed. We have put a very strong emphasis on local knowledge. We are shying away from calling it indigenous knowledge because people tend to then kind of have a particular picture in their mind. So local knowledges and diverse ways of knowing production, knowledge production are involved in each driver. And we find that none of the 10 social drivers will support deep decarbonization. So that's the result up front. However, some drivers, such as climate litigation, knowledge production, or UN climate governance, we find to be pointing into the right direction. I'll talk about that in detail in a moment. We need to observe them on an annual or biannual basis because often due to certain investment strategies and then the realization of these investments with regard to traffic or policies or whatever, that will take its time. So we can't really, you won't see jumps of improvement from one time to another. Where we see real big problems, and maybe Benjamin, I don't know whether that might be falling also into your work there because it's sort of on a social economy as well. So drivers which continue to undermine the pathways towards deep decarbonization are corporate responses in particular and consumption patterns. And it's interesting, most of the time when we see this, then consumption patterns, of course, that's us. I mean, directly here, you think, when did I go shopping the other day? And what's my community and so on. And you think, why can't we do something about it? But then, If you look at the United States, where the cars are larger than houses, and where people leave their engines running when they refill their petrol, which I can't get over still, and that's sometimes then you think, okay, there's a lot of communication involved, and you can't really, it's a long process. I say something about corporate responses because it's not as bad as it sounds. There are corporations are making the right noises, but they need to deliver as well. And the interesting aspect is out of the 6 physical processes that we have looked at, like permafrost thaw, amok instability, and Amazon forest dieback, may only moderately inhibit the plausibility of attaining the Paris Agreement temperature goals. This is in part due to the very long-term change that these processes take, and some of them have already been, like Amazon forest dieback is of course continuously affected by societal action and yes, diverse actions. So what we, with the social drivers, the 10 social drivers, will just demonstrate a strong role for a human agency in either way. So there's also a potential, even though it's not fully used at this current stage. And what we say here, and it's not surprising, but we feel that especially climate science needs to bang on and sort of point to these factors much more. And these are the conditions of injustice and social inequality around the world, which actually are the bread and butter, if you wish, of these social dynamics that we need to change. So in the report, if you look at it, you'll find key concepts and guiding principles, but I want to move forward a little bit, first with the outcomes of the last outlook and then towards the next one. The first outlook was the question, the lead question was, is it plausible that the world will reach deep decarbonization? And the leading assumption was that social drivers generate or reproduce resources, which then acquire the status of repertoires, which acquire certain materiality so that they are used by other drivers around the world. And that's part of our social plausibility assessment framework, which it's not a model, it's an assessment framework, and I come to that in a moment. Here, this is the framework. We start out with the assumption that that the social sciences work with reference to 3 core dimensions. One is history. And this is where our social drivers come in as overarching social processes that generate change toward or away from deep decarbonization. And we find that certainly in science and technology and in climate studies, you often have an underappreciation of history in the literature. And the second is context, these enabling and constraining conditions, which are kind of the rules of engagement in any sort of context where a driver operates. That might be the local constitution, it might be the regulatory framework, the reference to a treaty. So institutional and regulatory factors that you can name, look at, and see how they change. And then the third one is agency that we take from, this is for those who study the social sciences or political science. This is taken from the political opportunity structure framework, which has been developed by Herbert Kitchelt and Sidney Tarrow, who have the example, many of you will know it if you do from environmental and climate research, who had really problems with how to analyze the effect of and the social protests around Hydro-Quebec as a transnational organization in North America in the 80s and 90s. And then how do you actually analyze transnational movement, social movement mobilization And why is it and how is it that resources work across borders in a transnational way? And so the idea was to look at resources that are produced both by social movements, but also used by them in different frameworks. And that's called the political opportunity structure. And we applied that to the global context and saying where these social drivers and societal agents around the world produce visible resources. And as these resources obtain visibility to others, to other agents around the world, and they have become used in an effective way, then they turn into what Charles Tilly would have called repertoires. They develop a script, they become something which is a reference which can be used in a meaningful way. And we call that the materiality of the resources. And so this is the framework that we suggested to use for all these social drivers to see, do you see a change in these conditions? Are they worse? Do they get better? And do you see more drivers using these resources? And that's what the other projects did. We look at a chosen climate future scenario, like in this case, deep decarbonization, as you see it there on the right-hand side. We look at selected drivers. In this case, I don't know whether this works. No, not really. UN climate governance was one of the social drivers. Transnational initiatives such as city transnational collaborations, climate related regulations, climate litigation is another driver. Journalism is a very broad and challenging driver. Knowledge production, consumption patterns, corporate responses, and fossil fuel divestment. And then the 10th driver is climate protests and social movements. So as you see, it's a pretty much a broad range, and we have specialists who work on these drivers. And we use, of course, the literature that's out there quite a bit, but we've also feed in from our current ongoing research. I have myself have collaborated with the climate litigation and the knowledge production group. So I have a bit of an idea of what's going on and how do you work with a driver. So then we try to assess the dynamic of the driver, and you see the outcome, is it positive, is it negative, and in which direction does it go? So that's as far as we don't call it a model, it's a framework. So the expectation is then when you zoom in there, that, as I just said, that from visibility, we observe a shift in the best cases towards materiality. That's from resource to repertoire. So, and that's then what we call a change of the global opportunity structure. Now, just to go through this and an example, I should probably say this social plausibility assessment framework has mainly been developed by a sociologist, Stefan Eickhut, who is a proper climate researcher and colleague at Hamburg, and myself. And so we basically tried in a kind of a long process to include people and engage and try to figure out how can we come together with the findings in a very diverse group. So we looked, for example, at knowledge production, climate litigation, and UN climate governance. What are visible resources? The IPCC report, climate models, transnational litigation networks, an entirely new form of political organization, and so on. These are resources which have been generated by the drivers over time. Then we look at individual and collective action. That's our agency, the green agency arrow, where we look at legal precedents, the Global Climate Summit, who is at the summit, transnational litigation networks, and so on. And then we can identify the outcome as the new kind of repertoires like climate damage attribution or climate and financial risk assessments and so on, where then other drivers with climate litigation it's the next example. I'll look at climate litigation so that we see how one driver in particular works. And then we have modified enabling and constraining conditions. So if we are just as an example, just look at climate litigation, that's the case. I mean, Australia has been in the news, even with school children bringing a case. In Germany, we had a big case which brought constitutional change. And in the Netherlands, we have the case and so on. I mean, these cases are currently on the rise, and they are we're cautiously optimistic. So visible resources, if you look at that, are like the Global Climate Summit and so on, as I just said. Then we move in the German Constitutional Court case. That's an area, an arena, or a site where we then zoom in to actually look what has been said, what has been generated, and the Shell case, for example, in the Netherlands. And then we look at here very specifically what are effects on resources with regard to legal resources, socio-political resources, economic resources, and risks of negative effects. And you see how it's really important to involve lawyers, but also social scientists in these kind of interdisciplinary research operations. And it takes a lot of time, and also you need to be up to date quite a bit. And then again, we are looking at the changed outcomes. There is, of course, a grain of salt if you think in terms of the United States and lots of climate litigation cases, what with the change of balance in the Supreme Court, then that the climate litigation dynamic can be influenced in quite a negative way by strong players internationally. So the key findings were then for the 2021, deep decarbonization worldwide is not plausible. We have only limited, that's really important. We assume that we only have very limited capacity in predicting. So we need to observe regularly. That's one of the findings. And the next one, and this is our current outlook, looks at emissions and temperature goals. Now, for this current outlook that we just published, the leading question was, what affects the plausibility of attaining the Paris Agreement temperature goals? So specifically on that, the leading assumption was that if social driver dynamics undermine the plausibility of deep decarbonization, what is the effect of the interplay between physical processes and social drivers? And we are looking at these cases that I mentioned in the beginning, 16 distinct cases of drivers and physical processes. So now for this one, we used an integrated CLICS assessment framework, which is not just taking account of social drivers, but also you see this, what I call an egg, the egg model, where the physical processes are also part. And I zoom into that model in a moment, and we come out with a path. So here, against the background of our previous findings, we basically said, given our understandings of social dynamics and available empirical evidence, the deep decarbonization scenario is not plausible, even though it still might be plausible in a technical and physical sense. And this is really where we sort of the discussion centers, and we feel we need much more discussion, because the possibility is there, but the plausibility is not there. And the dynamic, the strong input of that is our societal dynamics. And so to account for both worlds, we establish this CLICS plausibility assessment framework, where we have our physical processes, we keep the social drivers, we keep the idea of the opportunity structure, and we're looking at the possibility, where do we actually end up, like between these temperature goals. And now this is what the model looks like if we enhance it a little bit. So the idea is to illustrate how social drivers of deep decarbonization in the gray arrow and physical processes all around the arrow are embedded and act and exist within the physical, that's the eggshell, the physical boundary conditions. So we're trying to bring these different factors together. And so both influence each other in ways that maybe we wouldn't have expected, and so that's what we are trying to do, and that's where we have invited the life sciences to also address the opportunity structure. So they are all talking, if you're looking at the report, about enabling and constraining conditions and how that actually moves ahead. And that's quite an effort that has been put into this, even just alone the use of the language, and bringing these together, the two perspectives, in a meaningful way. And we use always a chosen climate scenario, and this is the deep decarbonization goal in 2050 and the Paris temperature goals. Now, as you see, the social drivers in physical dynamics and their enabling and constraining conditions leads to a conjecture about the plausibility of the selected scenario. And that's really what we wanted to talk about. So what we have here is we have the circle, we have the social plausibility of deep decarbonization, and we have and we basically see that it's central to limiting global surface temperature increases, whereas the physical plausibility is assessed also with respect to the global surface temperature increase of below 2%. And you already see, again, I'm not a life scientist, but this is more a question of medium or high confidence in which we can address, with which we can address that. So the key findings of the current outlook are reaching worldwide deep decarbonization is currently not plausible. The physical processes inhibit the plausibility of attaining the Paris Agreement temperature goals only moderately. That's really important, because people often, it's a way of how we actually talk to citizens, to communities, who always think, oh, we see these pictures on TV, in the telly, in our bubble, wherever, of the melting Arctic ice, and this is the tipping point, and now we can't do anything anymore. Sort of the dramatization of these events. I'm just putting this out, sort of perhaps in rather simplistic words, but this is how people these days, who feed their information, feed for information through bubbles, will only see yes or no, black or white. Is it possible? Is it not possible? And not everything can be defined by physics and the life sciences alone. So the 2 points that we wish to make, the message to take away, is really meeting the 1.5 agreement temperature goal is not possible, but limiting the global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees can become plausible if ambition, implementation, and knowledge gaps are closed. And I want to finish with I hop over this one. This is kind of the final thing, our path. So what's happening? What are the most which factors develop dynamics away, and which drivers are cautiously hopeful? So what we have here is we have both processes on a path. We have, as you see in a moment, drivers and processes in the gray area here. We have, first of all, drivers that are ambivalent about reaching deep decarbonization, the social drivers, and we have physical processes that do not affect the temperature goals. And here we see the processes, the polar ice sheet melt, the Arctic sea ice decline, the regional change on climate sustainability, and we see ambivalent effects also with the media social driver. And we see several drivers are closer to supporting decarbonization. This is where the action is, where a lot of plausible dynamics. We see plausible dynamics in the making. We see the possibility, but they are not used to their full extent yet. And then, of course, we've got those drivers. And then we see in the red hexagon, the corporate responses, consumption patterns, and in the light red hexagon, the Amazon forest dieback, the amok instability, and permafrost thaw, as moderately inhibiting the Paris Agreement climate goals. So this is where it comes together, and in a sense, and that's usually what comes up in the discussion is, what comes next? What do we do? What do we do next? But what we wanted to emphasize is that currently no social driver is on path to supporting a deep decarbonization. And if we think back to the 70s and the first reports on climate change and how long we have been, actually this thing has been going on, the question that comes up again and again is, where have we gone wrong? Or where's the point of when do we kick off with a more intense interactive type of social science or interdisciplinary approach where we bring science and citizens behind that project. And that is not an issue of science alone. As the final slide, notably the impact of some physical processes on the plausibility of climate future scenarios depends on the trajectory of social processes. The 1.5 goal is not plausible, even though not impossible. And the scope and pace of social transformations toward climate action are crucial overall. And I think that's where I wanted to thank you for your attention. I hope I didn't speak for too long. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Antje, for a really, really interesting talk. Maybe not too optimistic, but realistic perhaps, or at least plausible. So I'm happy to open the floor for any questions or comments. Yeah. Just wait for the microphone, please, so people online can hear you too.
It's a bit of a two-parted question. The first minor one really is about what made you choose those drivers over other possibilities, if there were. The other one was whether, as part of your project, you have a theory of change for each of those drivers, if we want to be increasing, decreasing, or whatever it is that we want to do and changing them. That's the work to be done. So
yeah,
what's the theory of change on that? Yeah.
Do you want me to answer straight away?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Well, obviously the choice of drivers was also a reflection of what is the research that we can actually, where we have the expertise and the competence in the house. And since we have about 200 people working there on this project, these were the kind of choices. We would always say they are just an example. They are not sort of determining everything. We would invite people to bring in other social drivers, and maybe with the use of the model, we'd be happy to be contradicted using the same kind of method to say, look, I mean, there are other drivers that are working much, sort of developing better dynamics. Happy to. And we are working on the follow-up grant application where we will have a much stronger focus on types of varieties of agency that come into play, for example. And we are also trying to bring in more socioeconomic and political science modeling, like in the sense of really kind of larger public opinion surveys and so on. Because we also found that, especially with the media driver and with the political movements, with the regulatory framework, much more research is required to follow up this. But I think the theory of change is a very good point, and I take that away from here. Thank you.
Thanks. There's another question.
Thank you, Antje. The question is, with your view on the legal litigation process, that's a very individual and fairly sort of narrow group of people doing that. Where do you see that sitting in your research relative to the social change that you're talking about? So, the broader community. How do you put that in your, the two very individual perspective versus the broader social change?
Yeah, that's a good point. Especially with the new with one of the resources turned repertoire, like the transnational litigation networks. Those are really interesting because they are often hybrid. They bring a legal action and societal action together. These networks have been used before in sort of with regard to the torture prohibition and other norm violations in international relations, especially, I don't know how much you are into this, but this model really has been kicked off by a German human rights lawyer, Wolfgang Kalik, who founded the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, and who started the litigation, the case against Donald Rumsfeld for the torture violation. I've been very closely related with this process. And the question at the time was, will it work if we start, exactly your question, as a single lawyer to bring this case? And often you only have kind of very few litigants who actually dare to do it. And will this snowball into society? Will the social movement, the NGOs and so on, will they pick up the ball and run with it? And the effect was phenomenal in that case, even though the case was not won, but the publicity of much of the background in this particular torture prohibition case was such that we now have cases that have been won against torturers in Syrian prisons and so on. And the interesting aspect here is that we have these centers, the legal centers, which are mostly a non-profit NGOs sitting in different cities around the world. And the social movements and the lawyers are referring to these centers in a transnational way. And so as such, this is a new structure of how it plays into sort of work by international law colleagues like Schiff Berman, Rouse Talia, all sorts of other people who work in international criminal law. And we found this to be working also quite well. And there's a huge debate amongst lawyers, of course. Lawyers always debate everything. Is this really law? Is it not law? Whereas in our case, in international relations, where Jackie and I are working, it's often more important to say, is it a norm that is actually recognized, and will it change people's behavior or won't it? And a number of lawyers would follow us, but not all of them. So yes, you can start something, and this, in the best case, as it has done with the climate cases, that is often, the climate cases are often closely related with, like Fridays for Future, especially the German constitutional change case, Neubauer versus Republic of Germany. I mean, it's a big one. And she used to be a pupil, now a student. I mean, whatever, she's 26 now. And she is a very, sort of, she's a German figurehead of the Fridays for Future movement, comparable to the Greta Thunberg of Sweden. So, they collaborate a lot, and Greta will come to support the cases and so on. So this is happening. where it will go, we can't predict it, but it's there at the moment. You're welcome.
Yep, Jackie. I've got a few questions online as well, so we go there in a minute.
Thanks so much, Antje. I'm just wondering about, like, not just the choice of the drivers, but the weighting of the drivers in terms of the implications of the framework. So you had the media down there as ambiguity. Does that mean that we should focus our effort on those which are so far from the pathway? What are the implications of the framework? How do we focus our efforts? Are there recommendations from the findings?
I think that's a great question. And also, of course, it's a fellow social scientist question. Like also, is there a theory of change and how do you weigh them? I don't know who's listening online, but I could say, unfortunately, there's also people who are not following the clean social science method. No, but that's not the point. Why do we use the framework, and why do we think keep using it is meaningful? First of all, we use the framework for a mapping exercise to see how do we actually, what we have in terms of social science and other data, where are they, how do we get them, zoom into the cases, and where are they in relation to dynamics? When we started this, we had tables across the board, and we were just bringing in the various insights that we had from the literature and from our research to come up with a model that looks at dynamics, or an assessment framework is the first step. Now we can kind of locate the drivers and the physical process in relation to the dynamics. And the next step is going to be in the what we hope will be the second funding period, starting in probably in 26. That's about densification. We try to work with densification of which repertoires do we feel are more relevant for more drivers. So it's kind of, you go with this opportunity structure model, that's kind of the screening, and then we can become more analytical. At least that's what we hope. But that's where we are. And I think the question is, absolutely, I'm with you on that. Yeah.
Okay, I'm happy to move to some of the online questions. Tell me, would you?
All right, we've had a flurry of online questions and votes for the question. And currently our top one is from Stefan Kaufman. I'm curious how the exercise handled the interaction effect of analysing and reporting on plausibility on the likelihood of different scenarios emerging, i.e. by declaring 1.5 degrees implausible or plausible and different actors taking this into account, do we change the outcome?
Well, I think it's also a very good question, because I think it might relate to the concept of social tipping points, and we really caution against this concept, because often if you use the concept of especially a social tipping point, then people will assume it's not just a number, but with a social tipping point into one direction, and that's downwards, the promise and hope is completely gone, which is also not it's not accurate with regard to the data that we have. And as we said, whilst we have to say, as academics who work solidly on their stuff, none of the 10 social drivers will support the plausibility, but we can also say there are possibilities if we use them. And this is something that is very hard to represent if you use a model where you come towards a tipping point, and after a particular point, it's downhill, if you wish. That kind of feeds into the populist discourse, and also into a kind of over-dramatized disaster discourse.
Thank you. We have our second question from Julia Vich. So the big fossil producers made a $200 billion profit last year, planning to invest not in switching direction to sustainable technologies, but in more exploration for fossil fuels and in carbon capture, so that they can keep doing what they're doing. these are not decarbonisation drivers. What do you think can influence these types of companies?
Well, I mean, that's not the driver I've been working on, but there are obviously various factors, and that's perhaps one way of looking at it is that we always, when we do carry out the analysis with the social plausibility assessment framework, we look with which other drivers does one driver interact. So here you will see an interaction with obviously climate litigation, with the political protest driver. You will probably have the corporate responses panel, where, and also several other drivers will come in there. I think we would look at that. And then one other thing that is also important is, and what we often don't see in the data, is that when we talk to people, off the record, outside the boardroom, to big companies, then they will often say, well, we are quite happy to engage in the following steps and work on this, but it requires all sorts of collaborations with other drivers and other actors. And that's something that needs to be explored in a better way. Thank you.
Do you have one more? I'm also going to look at the room. I've got a question myself if there's time, but if you have one more, please go for it.
Yeah, okay. So what needs to be done to have the social drivers, in particular consumption and corporate responses, to have them change so that they contribute to achieving climate goals?
I think a lot is, I mean, that comes a bit back to Jackie's question on the media and the sort of the ambiguous role of the media. Communication via media changes very quickly. Who's using which type of media? In which country is the press actually still carrying out the task of informing the population in the best possible way? So this again will be a question of an interplay between drivers, especially with reference, it seems to me, to communication. And that's also where we come in as an higher education institution. Yeah.
Actually, it's a good question to the question I had is what's sort of the spatial scale that you focus your analysis on? And I wonder, follow up on that, if it's useful, would it be useful to sort of dive down and sort of comparative analysis of these social drivers across different countries? Because we might see certain countries where social drivers actually moving ahead quite quickly in the right direction, whereas others that's not the case. And that connects back to the question of theory of change. What's happening there, and can we sort of learn from that? What are those drivers? That how can we influence those drivers and move direction in other countries?
Absolutely. We have already seen that. How can I best put it? Because the process has not been finalized yet. That certain funding organizations are quite interested in supporting the application of the assessment framework in one particular country. And there's lots of money available for that. And it's for long-term research in larger research teams. And so we can envisage that this is done not just in one country for the development an annual assessment of drivers in one country, but that it's going to be done in various countries. And this is, of course, where also large funders like Horizon 2020 and so on would be possible potential funders for that. Yeah.
Then I had a second question, which is around, I guess, how your framework is dealing with events, which is in a way different from drivers. And just two examples, like the Fukushima explosion in Japan has massively changed direction in, for instance, Germany in the energy transition, and more recently the Russian invasion of Ukraine similarly has accelerated the energy transitions in many European countries. How is your model incorporating those kind of maybe quite unexpected and anticipated events?
Yes, I mean, we had a big discussion about these disruptive events, and they are actually addressed by some of the physical processes. And I'm not really the best person to elaborate on how they actually work, but they are certainly addressed because, especially with the physical processes, they do tend to have an important impact on, if you look at the flow of warm or cold air and in various directions, and what that then actually the effect on the rainforest or on the Arctic ice formation. There's certainly that is there. Yes, that needs to be incorporated, and that is part of the physical processes.
Does it also include social events like wars?
Yes, we looked at, and then this also part of the in this outlook. We certainly found that the Russian aggression towards Ukraine has had a direct impact on the work on the Arctic, because Russia was was supposed to be the chair of the Arctic Council from 21 to 23 and has withdrawn. And so the Arctic Council was a prime example of international collaboration despite political differences. And this has a quite considerable effect on how policies on the Arctic can be developed, for example. Yeah.
Thanks. Yep.
Can I just add to what Rob said? I think it's a really good point about events. And maybe this is where we can see the interaction actually of physical processes and social drivers, because I wouldn't be the only social scientist to say this, but climate-induced natural disasters are social events, because how the society and its infrastructure kind of experiences even a physical process depends very much on their social drivers. So in a way, we can't actually separate the social from the physical process. So just to give you an example, you mentioned the earthquake you experienced in Wellington, New Zealand last week, was it? Okay, there's sometimes these earthquakes not that much smaller than the one in Turkey and Syria, right? But the massive difference in the regulations and the laws and the way the physical infrastructure has been built, affects how that community experiences the physical process, and therefore the extent to which that event could be, I know you don't, change the trajectory, for the pathway to the 1.5.
Yes, one of our 6, you wanted to.
A conceptual point, which is that the whole concept of risk depends on a merging of those two dimensions, which you've there.
No, we are aware of that, and that's part of it. And what one of the 6 physical process is actually on the dieback of the rainforest, which includes the reference to societal factors in the description as well. Yeah. So obviously we are living in the Anthropocene, which tells us, what the impact is, and the source of the impact.
All right. With that, I think we have to stop here. Thank you very much again for your really, really interesting talk and coming all the way down here from Germany. And thanks everyone for joining us in the room and online. And I hope to see you next time as well.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.